Daniel Klein. Every time I find the meaning of life, they change it. Wisdom of the Great Philosophers on How to Live. What's the meaning of life? How should one live? These are some of the big questions many of us start asking ourselves when we're young. Daniel Klein was a particularly curious young man, choosing to study philosophy at Harvard. While he was a student, he started to keep a notebook, which he filled with pithy, memorable quotes from some of the great philosophers. Everyone from the Roman Stoic Marcus Aurelius to the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. Klein also jotted down his own thoughts, reflecting deeply not just on the quotes, but on philosophy and life more generally. When he reached his 80s, Klein decided to blow the dust off his notebook and add some new reflections. In this blink, we'll look at his personal commentary on some of the most thought-provoking quotes from Western philosophy. The pithies, as Klein calls them, often raise more questions than answers. But what questions they raise. So let's dive in and see what we can learn. Epicurus. The first entry in Klein's notebook is a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you have not. Remember that what you now have was once among the things you only hoped for. Epicurus is making 2 points. Firstly, wanting something that we don't have negatively affects our appreciation of what we do have. And secondly, when we think about the outcome of getting that thing we want, we realize that it puts us back to where we were before, in a state of desiring something else. So the big lesson here is, appreciate the present. It doesn't get any better than this. The philosophy of Epicurus resonated with Klein as a young man, and interestingly, it seems that he still appeals to many students today. Perhaps it's because there's something almost New Agey about Epicurus, with his pithy, Zen-like aphorisms. In today's world, there's a lot we can learn from him. Many of us are waking up to the fact that constantly striving for more things, more achievements, isn't actually making us happy. We're also realizing that perfectionism is a trap, a way to never be satisfied. Now that Klein is older, the words of Epicurus resonate even more. They make him reflect on his tendency to drift away from the present by thinking, what's next? Even if he's not necessarily desiring something, he's always thinking about the future. For instance, while he's eating dinner, instead of focusing on the food, he's thinking about what he's going to do after dinner, what book he's going to read, or what movie he's going to watch. It's been this way his whole life. As a child, he was always thinking about what he would do when he grew up. At college, he was focused on what he would do when he graduated, and so on. But when you live like this, you're essentially diluting your life. In the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, we're always getting ready to live, but never living. Now, if you're religious and you believe in the afterlife, perhaps this makes sense. Perhaps you think that this life is just the preparation, the warm-up for what really matters. But that's not what Klein believes. And at his age, in his 80s, he knows what's next. Without the payoff of an afterlife, it makes sense to focus on the here and now. Rather than wanting what we don't have or fantasizing about the future, let's just enjoy the present. Jean-Paul Sartre. Turning the pages of the notebook, we find another pithy quote, "Existence precedes essence." This one is from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. In just 3 words, Sartre manages to sum up a whole philosophy. Existence precedes essence is the foundation for modern existentialism. What Sartre is saying here is that unlike objects, a toaster, for example, We humans can't be defined by our properties. A toaster is made to toast bread. This capacity to toast is the very purpose and essence of a toaster. But humans don't have a defining essence. First, we simply exist, and then we create ourselves. We can change our properties and purposes. Now, obviously, there are some things, like certain physical properties, that we can't self-create. You can't will yourself to be tall, or be from Morocco if you're not. But the things that really matter, like how exactly we want to live our lives, are up to us. When Sartre says that existence precedes essence, he's not just describing a potential, he's encouraging us to embrace our human capacity for self-creation. If we don't, we basically allow ourselves to be objects. Historically, many of us have tended to see ourselves as objects, due to Judeo-Christian beliefs about God and how we've already been stamped with our essence from the very beginning. But according to Sartre, we can and should stamp ourselves. We have both the capacity and responsibility for self-creation. Of course, this idea can seem a little scary. If you're the master of your fate and you don't like how things turn out, you have no one to blame but yourself. No wonder we tend to shirk responsibility. But for Klein, the statement existence precedes essence resonates more than any other philosophy of life. It resonated when he was a college student, and it still makes total sense to him now. The meaning of life is not something to look for, but something that we ourselves create. To Klein, that notion feels not just right, but essential. Viktor Frankl. Here's another quote from Klein's notebook, simple but profound. Live as if you were living a second time, and as though you had acted wrongly the first time. These are the words of Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and neurologist from Vienna. Like Jean-Paul Sartre, Frankl was an existentialist, and he came to this philosophy as a result of some uniquely harrowing life experiences. For 4 years, Frankl was imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. Both his wife and his parents were victims of the Holocaust. Frankl survived and returned to Vienna, where he wrote a book about his experiences, Man's Search for Meaning. He also came up with a radical new approach to psychotherapy. This form of therapy, logotherapy, has a fundamental principle. Even if we feel like we have no control over our lives, we can still control our attitude to life. And we can still find meaning in our existence. This is a freedom that can never be taken away from us. Over the years, some people have criticized Frankl's philosophy for being too simplistic, too close to generic messages about the power of positive thinking. But actually, there's something to be said for positive thinking. And just because a thought is simple doesn't mean it's simplistic. As Klein puts it, every now and then Oprah Winfrey has a message that's worth paying attention to. Klein finds value in Frankl's philosophy, and in this thought experiment in particular. Let's look at it again. Live as if you were living a second time, and as though you had acted wrongly the first time. Now, the first part, live as if you were living a second time, is quite straightforward. It's easy to look back on our lives and imagine ourselves starting over, making different choices, marrying someone else, for example. But the second part, as though you had acted wrongly the first time, is something that Klein has struggled with. In order to know what acting wrongly means, we need to know what the right way to live is. What if we don't know? Now that Klein looks back at his notebook, he understands what Frankl was getting at. This thought experiment is a strategy we can use to find the right way to live. Generally, our minds prefer imaginative exercises to purely intellectual ones, and Frankel's experiment gives us something to work with. Now we have something concrete. In this experiment, we imagine that our current life is the wrong one. What might the right one look like? Frankel has given us a tool for our imaginations. We may not have the answers yet, but we can start dreaming up another way to live, a better way. Marcus Aurelius. Now, here's a keeper. Do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. If Klein had to choose one lesson to carry with him until the very end, it would be this one. It's a quote from Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. And if it sounds a bit familiar, it's probably because this is what philosophers and religious teachers have been telling us for centuries. Be mindful. Be present. Marcus Aurelius was saying it 2,000 years ago, and people keep coming to the same conclusion. Just look at the words of Henry David Thoreau writing in the 19th century. You must live in the present. Launch yourself on every wave. Find your eternity in each moment. If philosophers keep repeating the message, it suggests that humans struggle to live in the present. But why is it so hard? Klein has a couple of theories. He suspects that on some level, living fully in the present frightens us. Maybe we avoid the present because we're afraid of being disappointed by our own lives or by life itself. Another possibility is that living in the present makes us more aware of our own mortality. Think of a time when you've experienced a fleeting moment of bliss, sparked by a natural wonder or an amazing piece of music. These moments bring us into the present and fill us with joy. But then, all too quickly, they're over. We're left with the awareness that everything ends, us included. This is why the French refer to la petite mort, or the little death that sometimes follows orgasm. Sex is one of the few activities that forces us to be present. But after the climax, it's over, and some people are left with a feeling of melancholy. The little death reminds us of the inevitability of the big one. Still, while on some level we're scared of the present, it's also true that we want to feel fully alive. And ironically, sometimes that means tempting death. Some of us go hang gliding just to feel alive. Some daredevils even indulge in a sport known as volcano surfing, which involves speeding around the rim of a volcano on a board. This probably isn't something that Sartre had in mind when he was writing about the human condition, but it's an activity existentialist philosophers might approve of. Facing our mortality is perhaps the only way to become truly alive in the present. Reinhold Niebuhr. Let's finish with the quote that prompted Klein to stop collecting quotes. Every time I find the meaning of life, they change it. When Klein came across these words from Reinhold Niebuhr, his hobby of quote collecting suddenly struck him as being a little pointless. It was time to stop. And yet now, 40 years later, he's still fascinated by these philosophers and their ideas about how to live. He's also still intrigued by that quote, every time I find the meaning of life, they change it. To understand the point that Reinhold Niebuhr is making, some context might be helpful. Niebuhr was a Christian philosopher whose work explored existentialist themes. According to him, the human predicament is a tricky one. Although we're capable of contemplating the divine, we're still stuck with our flawed, finite minds. We can never see the big picture. So, seeking the meaning of life might seem like a futile exercise at times. Something else we should consider is that Niebuhr was concerned about humans' herd mentality. He was troubled by the rise of Nazism, and he recognized the human tendency to be influenced by culture. So maybe this is what Niebuhr was getting at with this particular observation. Philosophies of life are a product of culture, and cultures come and go. Looking back, Klein can see that his own philosophical beliefs were strongly influenced by the culture at the time. As a young man in the 1960s and 70s, he was receptive to the ideas of popular thinkers like Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre. There was definitely a bit of herd mentality going on there. Still, over the years, Klein has gained so much from philosophy. It's not that he's found a definitive answer to any of his questions. In fact, he's skeptical of anyone who claims to have the absolute answer. But even with these unresolved issues, he still finds it all fascinating, and he's struck by a pattern that's emerged. Looking back through his notebook, he realizes how many philosophers have stressed the importance of engaging in the present, to be here now. This has encouraged Klein to reflect more deeply on life. And after all these years, there's something that he's become absolutely convinced of. Firstly, each of us can consciously choose our own reason for living, whatever that might be. And secondly, deliberately choosing that meaning, that sense of purpose, is the key to a good life. Turns out that Klein really is an existentialist, after all. The main takeaway of this blink to Every Time I Find the Meaning of Life, They Change It, by Daniel Klein, is that philosophers' wisdom endures throughout the ages. Epicurus reminds us to appreciate the present rather than chase endless desires. Jean-Paul Sartre emphasizes freedom and responsibility in shaping our own lives. Viktor Frankl shows that even in suffering, we can choose our attitude and create meaning. Marcus Aurelius encourages us to be present and act mindfully. And a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr shows how cultural shifts influence our beliefs. Ultimately, philosophy is less about arriving at fixed answers and more about embracing questions. The recurring lesson across centuries of thought is simple yet profound. Be present, take responsibility for your choices, and consciously shape a life of meaning. For Klein, this deliberate pursuit of purpose is the essence of a good life. Okay, that's it for this blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next blink.